Snow covered the eastern Washington fields as Elias Kincaid rode home with his aging German shepherd beside him. The trip was supposed to be quiet, until Tolland began watching a woman seated several rows ahead. He never barked, never growled, but every time her old green instrument case moved, his attention followed. At the next stop, Elias finally saw the faded name attached to it, a name he had spent 16 years trying not to remember. What waited inside that clarinet case would not expose a villain or erase the past, but it would force Elias to see an old friendship differently. Sometimes the hardest thing to recover is not what was lost, but the courage to face what was left unfinished. Tell us where you're watching from, and if this story stays with you, please like and subscribe to help us reach 5,000 subscribers and keep these stories coming. The morning had that rare kind of winter brightness that made eastern Washington look almost unreal. Snow lay clean across the wheat fields outside Spokane, smoothing fences, ditches, and low rolling hills into pale shapes beneath a hard blue sky. Sunlight flashed off frozen irrigation pipes and the steel roofs of barns. Even the distant grain silos looked sharper in the cold, their long shadows stretching over ground that had gone white during the night. Elias Rowan Kincaid watched the landscape through the bus window without trying to decide whether it felt familiar. That was easier. At 58, he had learned that naming a feeling often gave it more weight than it deserved. Home, leaving, starting over. Those words had become dangerous because other people expected them to mean something definite. Elias had nothing definite. He only had 2 duffel bags in the luggage compartment, one weatherproof case of tools beneath the bus, a service dog at his feet, and a one-way ticket to Colfax Ridge. He had not sold everything. That mattered to him. The small apartment in Spokane was gone, but a storage unit still held several boxes of books, old electronics, a shortwave receiver he had rebuilt twice, and enough miscellaneous equipment to make returning possible if the experiment failed. Experiment. That was the word he preferred, not retirement, not coming home, not admitting Lenora had been right when she told him that living 3 hours away from everyone he loved was not the same thing as independence. Elias shifted slightly in the window seat. At 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that had resisted age better than his knees, he occupied more of the narrow bus seat than he liked. His charcoal green field jacket lay folded across his lap, revealing the olive drab combat shirt beneath it, fitted through the torso, the sleeves patterned in muted camouflage. He had worn some variation of that combination for years, not because he missed being in uniform, but because he disliked clothing that demanded thought. His hair, dark ash brown with silver concentrated at the temples, had been cut into the same clean undercut 2 days earlier. His jaw was freshly shaved. No beard to hide behind, no dramatic scars. Only the ordinary evidence of time around his steel blue eyes and the faint line between his brows that appeared whenever he listened too carefully. Tolland lay on the floor beside him. The German shepherd took up the space with practiced efficiency, large body folded close, paws tucked in, leash loose between Elias's boot and one broad foreleg. At 9, Tolland was still handsome in the way working dogs often were, without softness, without vanity. Warm golden tan covered his chest and legs beneath a wide black saddle that sat slightly uneven over his back. A thin dusting of silver had begun to show around his muzzle. The tip of his left ear folded forward just enough to distinguish him from any other shepherd at a distance. He wore a dark olive service harness. His breathing was slow. His eyes were closed. Elias knew better than to assume he was asleep. The bus rolled east. For the first 40 minutes, nothing happened. That suited Elias. The driver kept the heat slightly too high. A man 2 rows ahead coughed into his coat sleeve every few minutes. Someone in the rear wore headphones loudly enough for the drumbeat to escape. Tires hummed over dry pavement where county crews had cleared the highway, then changed tone whenever the bus crossed a patch of packed snow.
Elias listened without meaning to. He had spent too many years around radios not to sort sound automatically. Engine vibration, vent fan, loose panel above row 9.
Road noise under the right rear wheel. Tolson's breathing. Normal. Everything was normal. He looked down once and found the dog's front paw touching the side of his boot. It was something Tolland had begun doing after his second training cycle as a service dog. No command had created it. Elias had never encouraged it. The contact was simply there, light enough that most people would not notice. A reminder. You are here. Elias rested 2 fingers briefly against the dog's shoulder. I know. Tolland did not open his eyes. The bus pulled into the Cheney stop shortly after 9. Only 3 passengers were waiting beneath the shelter. The first was a college-aged man with a backpack. The second carried 2 grocery bags and immediately began arguing into his phone. The third was a woman with a small dark suitcase and a long instrument case wrapped in faded green canvas. Tolland opened his eyes. Elias noticed because Tolland did almost nothing abruptly anymore. The shepherd did not lift his head at first. His eyes simply moved. The woman climbed aboard. She was somewhere around 50, perhaps a little older, with chestnut brown hair threaded naturally with silver and gathered low at the back of her neck. She wore a gray camel wool coat over a dark forest green turtleneck, charcoal trousers, and black boots with salt dried along the edges. A muted cream scarf was looped once at her throat. Nothing about her asked to be noticed. The instrument case did. It was old, not neglected. Old. The canvas had faded unevenly from green toward gray, but the stitching had been repaired in several places with careful, almost invisible work. The leather carrying strap was darker from years of handling. One brass buckle had been polished, while the other remained dull. The woman turned sideways to get through the aisle. Tolland lifted his head. Elias glanced down. The dog's ears were forward, not alarmed, focused. The woman passed them. Tolland's nose moved once, then again. His body stayed still. Elias gave the leash the smallest amount of slack, not enough to suggest freedom, only enough to see whether the dog had caught an ordinary scent and would dismiss it. Tolland followed the case with his eyes. The woman continued down the aisle and took a seat in the 6th row. Elias watched the dog another second. Down! Tolland lowered his head immediately. No hesitation. His chin touched his paws, but his eyes remained open. Elias looked forward again. Nothing unusual, he told himself. Dogs notice things. Leather, oil, old fabric, someone's lunch packed in the case by mistake. The human mind was worse than a radio with a damaged squelch. Once it expected a signal, it could turn static into almost anything. The bus pulled away. For 10 minutes, Tolland behaved normally. Then the woman shifted the instrument case against the window. His head rose. A few minutes later, she reached down to steady it on a curve. His ears moved forward. She opened her handbag. Nothing. She adjusted the instrument case again. Tolland watched. Elias began to feel annoyed, not with the dog, with himself for paying attention. He reached down and rested a hand lightly against the shepherd's neck. Leave it. Tolland looked up at him. That was the moment Elias stopped dismissing the behavior. Tolland knew the command. More importantly, Tolland understood Elias. The dog usually broke focus the instant Elias asked. This time, he met Elias's eyes, then turned his head back toward the 6th row. It was not disobedience exactly. It felt more like disagreement. Elias removed his hand. Outside, the white field slid by under sunlight so bright it made him narrow his eyes. He had spent years learning not to assign meaning where evidence did not exist. That discipline had served him well in communications work. A weak signal was not a message until you could isolate it. A burst of interference was not hostile because it frightened someone. An assumption repeated 3 times did not become fact. So Elias did what he always did. He waited. 20 minutes passed. The woman in the 6th row took out a paperback, but read only a few pages. Once she rubbed her thumb along the hardened skin near her left index finger. then stopped as if she had caught herself doing it. She looked tired rather than nervous. Elias deliberately turned back to the window. He did not want to become the kind of man who studied strangers on public transportation because his dog had shown interest in their luggage. His sister would have laughed at him. Lenora had always been good at recognizing the line between vigilance and foolishness. Her last message sat unread in his phone, despite the fact that he knew exactly what it said. "I'll be at the station. Don't pretend you forgot to tell me which bus." He had told her, eventually, after changing the subject twice. Elias almost smiled. That was another thing he had not admitted to himself. He was looking forward to seeing her. The knowledge made him uncomfortable enough that he checked the time. Pine Junction was 25 minutes away. The bus descended through a shallow valley where snow thickened along the tree line. Pines appeared among the open farmland, their branches carrying fresh white weight. Sunlight fractured through them in hard flashes. Tolland sat up. Elias looked down sharply. The dog had not been prompted by the road. The woman was fastening her coat. She slid the book into her bag, stood the instrument case upright between her knees, and checked something on her phone. Preparing to get off. Tolland rose. His movement was smooth but immediate. Elias shortened the leash. "Down." Tolland looked at him. "Down!" The shepherd lowered himself. For perhaps 5 seconds, then his head came up again, body angled slightly toward the aisle. Elias felt a small tightening under his ribs. He had not felt that exact sensation in years. Not fear. Recognition of deviation. Something expected to behave one way had behaved another. The bus slowed. A speaker crackled overhead. "Pine Junction, 10-minute scheduled stop. Connections eastbound may be affected by road conditions." Passengers began gathering bags. The woman from row 6 lifted her suitcase first, then the green case. Tolland stood again. This time, Elias did not repeat the command immediately. He watched. The woman entered the aisle. Tolland did not bark, did not growl, did not bare his teeth. His tail remained low and still. As she approached, the shepherd took one controlled step forward until the leash became taut. Elias held him there. "Easy." The woman slowed. She looked first at the dog, then at Elias. "Is he all right?" Her voice was calm, no alarm. "He's fine." Elias meant it. Tolland was not acting threatening. That almost made it stranger. The woman moved another half step. Tolland extended his muzzle toward the side of the instrument case. He inhaled once near the worn canvas strap, then stopped. His whole body seemed to go quiet. Elias knew that posture. He had seen it when Tolland had identified something worth holding in memory. A scent, an object, a location, without yet knowing what action would follow. But Tolland was no longer working. There was no task, no reason. The shepherd turned his head, looked directly at Elias, and waited. Elias felt the bus, the people, the heat, the engine vibration recede from his awareness. His gaze dropped to the case. The woman followed it. Near one lower buckle hung an old luggage tag, its plastic cover yellowed and scratched. Most of the writing had been rubbed away. Elias leaned slightly closer. 4 letters remained clear enough. J.C. Below them, faded almost to nothing. Halston. For a second, Elias heard absolutely nothing. Then every sound returned at once. The driver speaking near the front. A suitcase wheel hitting the step. The hiss of the door opening. Someone laughing outside. Tolland's breathing. Halston. The name was not rare enough to prove anything. That was his first thought. His second was that he had not seen those letters together in 16 years. His third was not a thought at all. A radio room under bad fluorescent light. A voice behind him saying, "You heard what you wanted to hear." A metal chair shoved backward, a door closing. He shut the memory down before it completed itself. The woman had noticed. Her expression changed, not into suspicion, but attention. She looked from Elias to the tag. "You know that name?" Elias straightened. His face had probably betrayed more than he wanted. He hated that. Tolland remained standing beside him, quiet now that Elias had finally looked where the dog wanted him to look. Elias opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The bus driver raised his voice from the front. "Change of plan. Eastbound connections delayed." Ice farther up the pass. Could be close to 2 hours. A few passengers groaned. The woman glanced toward the front, then back at Elias. The instrument case remained between them. Outside, Pine Junction sat under clean winter light. One fuel station, a low diner, snow piled at the edge of the lot, the road disappearing east between trees. Elias had boarded the bus that morning because he wanted a smaller life, a quieter one, something with fewer obligations, fewer unfinished things, fewer reasons to look backward. Now, Tolland stood beside his knee, watching him, and hanging from a stranger's old green instrument case was the name of the one man Elias had spent nearly 16 years refusing to remember correctly.
Pine Junction was barely a place. A diner with 6 booths, a gas station with one working pump under a metal canopy, a bus shelter whose heater clicked more often than it produced warmth. Beyond them, the highway ran east between white fields and dark pines, disappearing beneath a brightness that made the cold look almost gentle. Elias stood under the diner awning for nearly a minute before going inside. He could have remained at the bus shelter, could have walked to the gas station, bought coffee, and spent the delay looking at his phone until the road reopened. Instead, he followed Tolland through the diner door. That irritated him more than he wanted to admit. Mara Ellison Vale had already taken a booth near the back window. Her suitcase sat beneath the table. The long green instrument case rested upright against the wall beside her, safely away from boots and melting snow. Tolland noticed it immediately. Not with the concentrated stillness from the bus, just a glance, then another. Elias guided him to a booth on the opposite side of the room. Under. The shepherd lowered himself beneath the table. This time, he stayed. A waitress in a red apron appeared with a coffee pot before Elias had removed his coat. "Road crew says 90 minutes if they're lucky." Elias looked at the window. "Usually are they?" "No." She filled his cup anyway. Across the diner, Mara smiled into her own coffee. Elias pretended not to see. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. He preferred that. He checked Lenora's latest message. "Roads are fine here. I'll wait. Stop pretending I'm inconvenienced." Below it came another. "And eat something." He locked the phone. The waitress returned. "Your sister?" Elias looked up. "Excuse me?" "That expression," she pointed toward the phone with the coffee pot. "Only family can annoy somebody before breakfast from 50 miles away." Elias almost corrected her on the distance. Instead, he ordered eggs. When she left, Mara spoke from across the room. "She's probably right." Elias glanced toward her. "About what?" "Eating?" Her voice was easy, not intrusive. He looked back at his coffee. "That seems to be everyone's opinion today." Mara returned to the papers she had spread on the table. Elias tried not to look. That lasted 3 minutes. The papers were old photocopies and newer printouts, some clipped together, others marked with small handwritten notes. One page had what appeared to be a repair order. He recognized the shape of a military mailing address, even from across the room. The irritation returned. He knew what it was this time. Curiosity. Elias disliked curiosity when it belonged to him. Other people could afford it. He had spent too many years learning that information carried obligations. Once you knew something, you were responsible for what you did with it. Under the table, Tolland shifted and placed one paw against Elias's boot. Elias looked down. Traitor. The dog did not react. A few minutes later, Elias picked up his coffee and crossed the diner. Mara looked up. "Mind if I sit?"
She moved one stack of papers without comment. Elias sat across from her. Tolland settled beneath the edge of the booth, body angled so he could see both Elias and the green case. Elias nodded toward the tag. "Where did you get it?" Mara did not ask which object he meant. "The case?" "The whole thing." She folded her hands around her mug. "I restore woodwinds." Her fingers were narrow, but not delicate. The pads of her left thumb and forefinger carried the slight roughness of repeated fine work. "Mostly clarinets, oboes, bassoons, sometimes flutes, though I complain about them more than I should." "You own a shop?" "Not exactly." She paused. "I lease space in one." That answer had the shape of something more complicated, but Elias did not ask. Mara glanced at the instrument case. Arthur Bellamy owned a restoration shop in Spokane for 52 years. Bellamy Woodwinds. Family business, small place, no website worth mentioning. Half the customers knew Arthur before they knew how to play. Elias waited. "He died last spring. 84. His family asked me to help sort what was still in the building before they sold the property." "You knew him?" "For about 15 years. "Worked for him?" "Occasionally. Argued with him more often." That earned the faintest movement at one corner of Elias's mouth. Mara noticed, but let it pass. "Arthur kept very good records in some areas and terrible records in others. He had one cabinet in the back room with a handwritten sign." She turned one of the copies toward Elias. At the top was a photograph of a narrow metal storage cabinet. Across its doors in black marker, "Hold. Do not sell." Inside were 6 instruments, Mara continued, all tagged, all repaired, none collected. "Why keep them?" "Arthur had rules." "What rules?" "He never sold instruments left by active-duty military or veterans unless he had direct confirmation from the owner or family." "That sounds expensive." It was. And impractical. Also true. Mara took a sip of coffee. Arthur was very comfortable being both. Elias looked at the green case again. "The clarinet was in there." "Yes." "How long?" "Long enough for me to stop liking that question." She slid the repair order across the table. The paper had been photocopied from an older carbon form. "Customer name?" "Halston, Jonas Creed." Elias read it once, then again. There was no reason to. The letters were clear. He set the page down. Mara watched his face without staring. "You knew him?" It was not phrased as a question this time. Elias looked toward the window. Snowmelt ran in narrow lines down the glass. "Yes." "How well?" He took too long to answer. "Well enough." Mara did not push. That almost made him speak more. "Long time ago." She nodded. "I found his death record." Elias turned back. There it was. 5 simple words. He had known Jonas was dead. Technically. The information had reached him years earlier through a mutual acquaintance whose name he no longer remembered. Elias had read the message, alone in a parking lot. He had sat behind the wheel for 10 minutes, then driven home. He had not attended the funeral, had not called anyone, had not even searched for an obituary. He had told himself that whatever existed between them had ended long before Jonas died. Now, sitting in a diner with a clarinet case 3 feet away, the logic sounded thinner than it used to. "How long ago?" Elias asked. "About 5 years." He nodded once. Mara continued carefully. "I tried the last address Arthur had. The building had been renovated. I tried the number on the form. Disconnected. I found a Veterans Association contact, but they had no current family information." "No family?" "None I could verify as next of kin." Elias looked at the repair ticket again.
"You did all that for an abandoned clarinet?"
Mara's expression changed slightly. Not offended, evaluating.
"It wasn't abandoned. He never came back for it.
That doesn't always mean the same thing. Elias said nothing. For the first time since sitting down, Tolland lifted his head, not toward the case, toward Elias. Mara glanced beneath the table. He does that when you're annoyed? No. When you're lying? Elias looked at her. Mara's mouth curved faintly. I'm asking for professional reasons. What profession covers that? Instrument repair. People lie constantly about why something broke. Elias almost laughed. The feeling surprised him enough that he did not. Mara looked back at the paperwork. The only current lead I found was Colfax Ridge. Elias's attention sharpened. Why? Arthur kept correspondence with some customer files. Not much. Receipts, notes, shipping slips. She took out 3 photocopied envelopes, all addressed to a veterans group in Colfax Ridge.
Not recent. Not personal letters. At least not from the outside. Jonas's name appeared in the return corner. Elias touched none of them. What was he writing about? I don't know. You didn't open them? They weren't in the case. These are copies Arthur made of the envelopes for his records. Why would a repairman do that? Arthur copied everything. That contradicts what you said about bad records. No, his bad records were just extremely thorough in useless ways. That time Elias did laugh, once and quietly. Tolland's ears moved. Mara smiled. Then Elias's eyes dropped back to the name on the envelope. The warmth disappeared. He used to do that. Do what? Keep paper. Jonas? Elias nodded. Manuals, frequencies, receipts, old schematics nobody needed anymore. You work together? For a while. What kind of work? Communications. Mara waited. Elias did not elaborate. The silence between them changed. It was no longer the silence of 2 strangers. It had become the silence around a door one person had opened a few inches and was deciding whether to close again. Mara looked toward the instrument case. Was he a musician? Not professionally. You sound very certain. He made sure everyone knew the difference. A memory arrived before Elias could prevent it. Jonas sitting on an equipment crate with a clarinet across his knees, insisting that 3 people who could not tell B-flat from a truck horn were destroying his artistic standards. Calvin laughing so hard he spilled coffee. Elias reaching over and closing Jonas's music book because they were already late. The memory was ordinary. That was what made it hurt. Elias took his hand away from the repair ticket. He liked that thing more than most people. Mara looked at the case. So it is his. Elias did not answer immediately. Then, yes. The word felt heavier than it should have. Mara leaned back. Friend? Elias stared at the old carbon copy. Once. He could have stopped there. Instead, he heard himself corrected. Teammate. The correction landed badly. He knew it the moment it left his mouth. Mara did not call attention to it. She only gathered the papers into a neater stack. What happened? Elias looked at her. I didn't say anything happened. No. She placed the repair form on top. You changed the noun. That silenced him. Outside, a snowplow passed the diner, throwing a fan of white onto the shoulder. The noise filled the room long enough to give Elias somewhere else to look. 16 years earlier, the weather had been nothing like this. Heat, dust, a communications trailer that had become an oven after the ventilation failed. Elias remembered clipped radio traffic, 3 frequencies bleeding over one another, a movement order he had not trusted, and Jonas standing at the doorway telling him they were relocating. Elias had refused. Jonas had left with part of the equipment team. Minutes later, Calvin Whitlow went down during the confused movement that followed. Not from gunfire. Not from some cinematic attack, an accident inside a badly coordinated withdrawal. A fall. Equipment shifting where it should not have shifted. A bad moment made worse by incomplete information. Elias had spent years compressing it into something simpler. Jonas left. Calvin got hurt. Those two facts had sat beside each other long enough to become cause and effect. Jonas had seen it differently. Their argument afterward had been short and vicious. "You abandoned the position. I followed the movement order. You left us blind. You stayed because you thought you were the only one capable of being right." Elias still remembered the last sentence, not because Jonas had shouted it, because he had not. A week later, Jonas requested transfer. They never spoke again. Elias returned to the diner when Mara shifted slightly in the booth. "You don't have to explain it," she said.
I wasn't going to.
"I know." That annoyed him again. Mara seemed to have an irritating talent for accepting boundaries in a way that made them harder to defend. Elias nodded toward the case. "What exactly are you planning to do with it?"
There's a Veterans Community Office listed at the same Colfax Ridge address the letters went to. I was going to ask if anyone there knew him.
And if they don't?
I've already spoken with an archive that handles unclaimed military-associated personal property. They'll take it if I can't find anyone with a better claim.
You carried it out here yourself?
Yes.
Why not ship it?
Mara looked at the case for several seconds. Because Arthur didn't.
Elias frowned. She explained.
Every repaired instrument in that cabinet had been wrapped, tagged, and kept ready for pickup. He could have cleared the space years ago. He didn't. I figured the least I could do was finish the trip properly.
Elias studied her. You do this for all 6?
3 went back to families. 1 belonged to a living owner who had forgotten it existed. 1 turned out not to be worth the argument.
And this one?
This one wouldn't stay simple.
The waitress appeared with Elias's food. Neither spoke until she left. Elias looked down at the eggs. Lenora would be pleased. He was not. Under the table, Tolland suddenly rose halfway, not enough to stand, just enough to reposition. His nose angled toward the instrument case. Mara noticed.
Would it help if I opened it?
Elias's first instinct was no. He did not know why. Then he looked at Tolland. The shepherd was calm, attentive, not anxious. Elias exhaled. All right. Mara lifted the green case onto the empty side of the booth. The brass latches opened with 2 soft clicks. Inside, dark blue velvet had faded almost gray around the edges. The clarinet lay disassembled in fitted compartments, black grenadilla wood, polished but not glossy. Silver keys cleaned carefully.
Mara did not touch the instrument. Instead, she lifted a narrow internal flap near the lid. There was also this. A small canvas pocket had been sewn into the lining, nearly invisible against the old material. Inside were 2 tuning cloths, a pencil, several folded receipts, and a photograph. Mara picked it up. Her expression changed. Huh. Elias looked across the table. What? She turned the photograph around. The image was perhaps 7 years old. A concrete building, late afternoon sun, a man sitting on broad exterior steps wearing a faded brown-green field jacket. Jonas. Older than Elias remembered him. Sandy hair going silver, short beard. The same crooked half-smile Elias had seen hundreds of times. One hand rested on the neck of a young German shepherd standing beside his knee. Elias stopped breathing for half a second. The dog in the photograph had no silver around the muzzle. His chest was narrower. The black saddle looked darker against a younger coat. But the left ear already folded slightly at the tip. And on the inside of the right foreleg, just visible above the paw, was the pale golden patch Elias knew better than any marking on his own hands. He looked down. Tolland was staring at the photograph, then at the case, then at Elias. You knew him, Elias said quietly. The dog's ears shifted. Mara did not speak. Elias turned the photograph over. A date had been written on the back. 7 years earlier. Below it, Veterans Recovery Annex, Fort Lewis Outreach Day. Jonas had been there. Tolland had been there, and Elias had known nothing about it. The delay announcement came over the diner radio a few minutes later. Road crews expected the eastbound route to reopen soon, but the left ear already folded slightly at the tip. And on the inside of the right foreleg, just visible above the paw, was the pale golden patch Elias knew better than any marking on his own hands. He looked down. Tolland was staring at the photograph, then at the case, then at Elias. "You knew him," Elias said quietly. The dog's ears shifted. Mara did not speak. Elias turned the photograph over. A date had been written on the back. 7 years earlier. Below it, Veterans Recovery Annex, Fort Lewis Outreach Day. Jonas had been there. Tolland had been there. And Elias had known nothing about it. The delay announcement came over the diner radio a few minutes later. Road crews expected the eastbound route to reopen soon. Passengers began collecting coats and bags. Mara closed the case carefully. Elias remained seated. The old version of the story in his head had always been clean. Jonas had left. Elias had stayed. Years passed. Jonas moved on. But now there was a photograph Elias had never seen, showing Jonas years later with the dog who would eventually become the most constant presence in Elias's life. A coincidence, probably, nothing more. Still, as Mara fastened the final brass latch, Elias found himself looking at the green case differently. Not as something that had returned from the past, as evidence that the past had continued existing after Elias stopped looking at it. By the time the bus reached Colfax Ridge, the afternoon light had begun to thin. Snow covered the roofs in clean, pale layers. Pine trees lined the small central square, their branches weighted white, and strands of winter lights still hung above the storefronts, even though the holidays had passed weeks earlier. The bulbs reflected in the dark windows of the pharmacy, the diner, and a narrow brick library with 2 stone columns out front. Elias had forgotten how small the town looked from the road. Or perhaps he had remembered it larger because he had been younger. The bus sighed to a stop. Passengers began gathering coats and bags. Tolland rose beside Elias, stretching one rear leg carefully before settling into position at his left side. Elias noticed the stiffness. "Easy." The shepherd glanced up, then waited. Mara stood several rows ahead with the green clarinet case in one hand and her suitcase in the other. She looked back once, not as if checking whether Elias was following, but as if acknowledging that they had reached the same place for different reasons. Elias let her go first. Cold entered the bus the moment the door opened. It felt cleaner than the heated air inside. He stepped down onto packed snow and saw Lenora before she saw him. She stood near an old navy blue Subaru at the edge of the lot, one gloved hand wrapped around the steel thermos she seemed to carry everywhere. At 64, Lenora Kincaid Hale had softened with age in ways Elias had not. Her face was broader, warmer, framed by a chin-length bob of ash brown and silver hair escaping beneath a knitted cap. The eyes were the same as his, blue-gray, but hers had never learned to hide behind stillness. She stared at him for 2 seconds, then at Tolland, then at the 2 duffel bags being unloaded. "That's it?" Elias walked toward her. "That's what?" "Your life." He looked at the bags. "Most of it." Lenora hugged him before he could answer. Not dramatically. Not tightly enough to make a scene, just long enough that Elias became aware of how long it had been since anyone had done it without warning. He placed one hand awkwardly against her shoulder. "You're blocking traffic." "No, I'm not." "You might be. There are 4 cars here. That's traffic." She stepped back and studied him. "You look tired." "I was on a bus." "No." Elias knew that tone. Lenora had been using it since they were children. He reached for one of the duffel bags. "I'm fine." "That usually means you're not going to tell me." "Correct." Tolland approached her.
Lenora's entire expression changed. "There you are!" She crouched carefully and put one hand against the shepherd's chest. Tolland leaned forward enough to press his forehead briefly against her shoulder. Elias watched. The dog had always liked Lenora, perhaps because she never treated him like a symbol of anything.
To her, he was simply Tolland, who preferred roast chicken to kibble and disliked metal stairs. Lenora looked past Elias. Mara was standing near the curb, studying a printed address. "That your bus friend?" "No. She came off the same bus. So did 14 other people. None of them are holding a clarinet case you've been staring at." Elias looked at her. Lenora smiled. "Still observant. You've been here 30 seconds. Long enough." Mara approached before Elias could invent a reason to leave. "Excuse me," she said. "Do either of you know where the Veterans Community Office is?" Lenora glanced at the address. "Library." Mara looked toward the brick building. "That's the office?" "Depends what you mean by office." Lenora pointed across the square. "Side entrance, basement level. There's a meeting room underneath the reading room." Mara thanked her, then hesitated. Elias recognized the moment before she asked, "Would you mind coming?" Lenora looked from Mara to Elias.
Elias almost said no. He had arrived. That was enough for one day. He could go to Lenora's house, unload, feed Tolland, drink coffee too strong to be sensible, and wake up tomorrow with the clarinet somewhere else. The thought should have felt like relief. It did not. He looked at the green case. "I'll go." Lenora said nothing. That was worse than commentary. The library smelled of old paper, wet wool, and radiator heat. The main floor was nearly empty. A librarian pointed them toward a stairwell beside the reference section. Tolland descended slowly, careful on the rubber-edged steps. At the bottom was a hallway with framed photographs of local veterans, a bulletin board crowded with handwritten notices, and a half-open door marked Community Room B. Inside, 6 folding tables had been arranged in a loose square. A coffee maker sat on a side counter. Beside it were mismatched mugs, powdered creamer, and a tin of cookies that had probably been opened days ago.
A man in a dark green cardigan was adjusting the antenna on an old tabletop radio. He was slender, with a high forehead, soft silver hair combed loosely to one side, and a close-cropped gray beard. He looked more like a retired professor than anyone Elias would have associated with military medicine. When the radio produced only static, the man sighed. "Every machine in this room is older than my patience." Elias looked at the radio. "Loose ground." The man turned. "You can tell from there?" "Probably." "Good. That makes one of us." He crossed the room and extended a hand. "Benton Larkin." "Elias Kincaid." Recognition did not appear in Benton's face. That made Elias relax slightly. "Mara Vale," Mara added. "I'm looking for someone who may have corresponded with this group years ago." She placed the clarinet case carefully on a table. Benton's eyes went to the old tag. His expression changed. "Halston." Elias felt the reaction before he understood it. Not shock, not fear. Something closer to memory finding its place. "You knew him?" Mara asked. Benton shook his head. "Not properly." He pulled out a chair. "Name was on letters." Elias remained standing. "What letters?" Benton looked at him. "You knew him?" Elias did not answer immediately. Mara did it for him, without embellishment. "They served together." Benton accepted that. No curiosity, no sudden reverence. He simply walked to a gray metal filing cabinet near the wall and opened the second drawer. "I kept some of the old correspondence when the veterans group moved out of the VFW hall." "You keep everything?" Elias asked. "No, Greer keeps everything." As if summoned by the accusation, a voice came from the hallway. "I heard that!" A short, narrow-shouldered man entered, carrying a cardboard tray with 4 coffees. Greer Nolan Fitch looked permanently wind-chilled. His cheeks were pink from the cold, his salt-and-pepper hair stuck out beneath a dark flat cap, and a pair of reading glasses hung from a cord around his neck despite the fact
that he immediately began padding his coat pockets for them. Benton pointed at his chest. "Your glasses." Greer looked down. "Right." Mara smiled. Elias did not, but came close. Greer set the coffee down. "Who are we remembering?" "Jonas Halston," Benton said. Greer stopped moving. "That name I know." He looked at Elias, then at Mara, then at the case. "Well." He pulled out a chair and sat. "That explains the morning." "What morning?" Elias asked. "The one where Benton called me and said someone was coming with an old instrument and a stranger's name." Benton frowned. "I did not say stranger. You implied it. I said unresolved property. That's bureaucratic for stranger." Elias found himself watching them the way he once watched radio operators argue over procedure.
There was comfort in disagreement that had no real stakes. Mara opened her folder. "Mr. Halston sent letters here?" Greer nodded. "Several." "What about?" Greer looked toward Benton. "You kept copies?" "Some." Benton returned to the filing cabinet and removed a thin manila folder. The label was simple. Halston, J.C. No classification, no significance, just a name. Elias sat down. That surprised him. He had intended to remain standing. Benton placed the folder between them. Inside were 6 typed letters. No dramatic stationery, no personal confession. Single-spaced pages with corrections made in pen. Greer picked up the first. "This one came, what, 8 years ago?" "Closer to 9, Benton said. Greer adjusted his glasses. "Halston wanted to know whether we had any veterans who liked radio repair." Mara glanced at Elias. He ignored it. Greer continued, "Not professional electronics. Hobby stuff. Old receivers, cassette decks, guitar amps. Things people could take apart and put back together." Benton handed Elias another letter. He thought activity helped people who didn't like sitting in circles talking about themselves. Elias read silently. Jonas's writing style was immediately recognizable. Efficient, dry, too many parentheses. The letter asked whether the group had unused workspace, whether anyone had old equipment they were willing to donate, whether a local musician might be interested in informal sessions. Nothing grand, no project name, no funding proposal, no language about healing or transformation, just practical questions. One line caught Elias. "Does anyone there still like fixing old things, or have we all surrendered to throwing them away?" He read it twice. Something shifted. Not in the room, in the version of Jonas he had carried for 16 years. Elias remembered the man who left, the man who stopped calling, the man who transferred and disappeared from Elias's life. He had never imagined Jonas writing to strangers in a small Washington town, asking whether lonely veterans wanted to repair broken radios together. Greer was talking. Elias had stopped listening. He looked at the date. 7 years after the incident, 3 years before the photograph with Tolland. Jonas had not vanished. He had simply continued living somewhere Elias had refused to look. That realization bothered him more than anger ever had. Mara touched one edge of the letter. "Did you answer?" Greer nodded. "A few times." "What happened?" "We had no space then. The group was smaller. Benton was still working part-time." Benton added, "We suggested he contact the regional center." "Did he?" "Don't know." Greer turned another page. "He kept writing anyway." "Why?" Elias asked. Greer shrugged. "Maybe he liked the idea." That answer was too simple. Elias disliked it. People don't keep writing to a town they've never lived in for no reason. Greer looked at him over his glasses. "People do stranger things because they're lonely." The room went quiet. Not awkwardly, just enough. Tolland lay beneath Elias's chair, one forepaw resting against the side of his boot. Elias looked down. For once, the contact did not feel like a reminder to stay present. It felt like a refusal to let him retreat. Benton closed the folder halfway. "You don't have to read all of these today." "I didn't say I was finished." "No." Benton's tone remained neutral. "That's why I said it." Elias leaned back. He was beginning to dislike people in Colfax Ridge for being reasonable.
Greer smiled faintly, as if he understood. The last letter was shorter. Jonas asked whether anyone in the group still played music, clarinet, piano, guitar, anything. He mentioned having some arrangements that were probably less embarrassing than they sounded in my head. Greer had written back. A copy of the response was clipped behind it.
We have 3 radios that barely work, 1 piano that definitely doesn't, and 5 men who insist they cannot sing. You'd probably fit in.
Elias read the line. Then, unexpectedly, laughed. A real laugh this time, short, rough from disuse. Lenora, who had quietly joined them and was standing near the doorway with her thermos, heard it. She did not smile. She simply watched her brother, as if recognizing a sound she had not heard in years. That was the moment Elias noticed her. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough. You always say that, because you keep proving it true." The light outside the basement windows had turned blue-gray. Mara packed the letters back into the folder. Benton returned them to the cabinet. Greer left with 2 empty coffee cups and a promise to look for older postal records. No one announced that they had learned something important. Elias appreciated that. By the time he and Lenora drove home, snow had begun falling again. Not heavily.
Fine flakes crossed the headlights and vanished beneath the hood. Tolland lay in the back seat, finally asleep. Lenora drove. Elias watched the road. "You want to tell me?" she asked. "No." "All right." That answer irritated him more than if she had pushed. After a mile, he said, "You could ask again." "I could." "You won't?" "No." He turned toward her. Lenora kept her eyes on the road. "I spent 15 years asking you whether something was wrong every time Jonas's name came up." Elias looked away. "You never knew what happened." "I still don't." "Then how do you know it matters?" "Because you changed every time someone mentioned him." Elias said nothing. Lenora continued. "You'd get quieter. Not angry, not sad, just absent." The word landed uncomfortably close. Absent. He looked out at the snow. "I thought I was done with it." "You were done talking about it." "That's not the same?" "No." Lenora turned onto a residential road lined with low houses and tall pines. "It almost never is." Her house appeared ahead, warm light in the windows. Elias expected relief. Instead, he thought about Jonas's letters, the questions about radios, the broken piano, the joke about throwing old things away. He had spent years imagining Jonas as someone who had cut every tie and walked on. The letters suggested something less convenient. A man still looking for places to belong, a man still writing, a man Elias had reduced to the worst afternoon they ever shared. Inside Lenora's house, Tolland drank water, inspected the kitchen, then settled near the heating vent. Elias carried his bags into the guest room. He returned to find Mara's name on his phone, a message. "I found something else in the case. I think you should see it before I leave town." Elias stared at the screen. A second message appeared. "Not urgent. Tomorrow is fine." He appreciated that more than he wanted to. The next morning, Mara returned to the library with the clarinet case. Elias arrived 10 minutes late on purpose. Benton was not there. Greer was not there. Only Mara sat at the table by the window, winter sun falling across the green canvas. "I didn't want an audience," she said. Elias took the chair opposite her. "What did you find?" Mara opened the case but did not remove the clarinet. Instead, she pressed along the bottom lining near one corner. The velvet lifted slightly. Beneath it was a thin paper envelope, flattened by years of pressure. No dramatic seal, no warning, no instruction, just an old address written in black ink. Elias recognized it before Mara turned it toward him. His apartment in Tacoma. The one he had left more than a decade ago. At the top, Elias Rowan Kincaid. Below the address, in smaller handwriting, "Need current address before mailing." Elias did not touch the envelope. The date stamped faintly on the corner was 6 years old. Jonas had written it before he died.
not sent it, not hidden it for destiny to uncover, simply failed to find where Elias had gone. Mara waited.
Tolland sat beside Elias's chair, calm and silent. Outside the window, Colfax Ridge shone under new snow. Elias stared at his own name in Jonas's handwriting and understood something he had not been prepared for. He had spent 16 years believing the silence between them belonged to both men equally. Now, for the first time, he had evidence that one of them had eventually tried to break it. Elias did not open the envelope. That was the first decision he made. He left it on the dining table at Lenora's house, untouched, beside a ceramic bowl filled with keys, receipts, and 3 walnuts Lenora claimed she was going to crack eventually. For most of the morning, Elias behaved as if the envelope were not there. He fed Tolland, he checked the weather, he fixed the loose hinge on one of Lenora's kitchen cabinets because it had been irritating him since the night before. Then he took apart the old kitchen radio after noticing one channel cutting in and out. Lenora watched from the stove. "You know that worked yesterday. It barely worked. It played music. It produced sound. That's usually what music is." Elias ignored her. Tolland lay near the heating vent, chin on his paws, tracking the movement of Elias's hands. The radio was simple. Loose solder joint, 2 aging capacitors, 1 corroded contact, problems with edges, problems with causes, problems that could be found.
Elias preferred those. He repaired the contact, reassembled the case, and turned the radio on. The signal came through clean. Lenora poured coffee into her navy thermos. "Congratulations." It needed fixing. "So does that." She nodded toward the envelope. Elias did not look. "No." "No what?" "It doesn't need fixing." Lenora tightened the thermos lid. "Then why are you afraid to open it?" He turned toward her. "I'm not afraid." "Fine." She walked past him. "You're aggressively uninterested. That's not a thing. It is in this family." She left for work 10 minutes later. Elias remained in the kitchen. Tolland lifted his head. The envelope sat exactly where it had all morning. Elias finally picked it up. Not to open, only to move it. He carried it into the guest room and placed it inside the top drawer of the nightstand, then closed the drawer. That was better. For almost an hour. At noon, Benton called. Elias considered not answering. He answered anyway. "You opened it?" Benton asked.
"No." "Good." Elias frowned. "Good?" "If you'd opened it because you thought you were supposed to, you'd spend the next 10 years resenting the letter." "You always talk like this?" "Only when people call me a doctor." "I didn't." "Then I'm off duty." Elias heard paper shifting on the other end. Benton continued, "There's someone else you might want to talk to first." "I know who you mean." "Calvin Whitlow." Elias leaned against the kitchen counter. Tolland stood and moved closer but did not touch him. "I haven't spoken to Calvin in years." "Then this may be a good time." "You make that sound simple." "It is simple." "No, it isn't." Benton paused. "The action is simple. The rest isn't." That annoyed Elias because it was accurate. He looked toward the window. Snow had stopped. Sunlight ran along the top edge of the fence, bright enough to make the backyard almost painfully white. "I don't know what he remembers." "That may be the point." Elias said nothing. Benton gave him the number anyway, then hung up without telling him what to do. Elias wrote it on the back of a grocery receipt. For the next 20 minutes, he stared at 8 digits and an area code. Then he called. The line rang 4 times. A man answered. "Whitlow." The voice had changed, lower, rougher, but not enough. Elias was back 16 years in less than a second. "Calvin." Silence, then, "Well." Elias almost hung up. Calvin spoke again. "Kincaid." "Yeah." Another silence. Neither man apologized for it. "How are you?" Calvin asked. "Fine." "Still hate that question?" "Yes." "Good.
Some things survive. Elias sat down. Tolland moved beneath the table and placed one paw against the side of his boot. This time Elias did not look down. He could hear a radio playing faintly on Calvin's end of the call. Talk station, a garage door opening or closing, metal against concrete, ordinary life. Elias tried to imagine Calvin inside it.
The last clear image he had was of a younger man with a rectangular face, dark hair, and a habit of chewing mint gum during briefings. Now Calvin was 61. Elias knew from old acquaintances that he lived somewhere outside Bend, Oregon, and worked on old motorcycles when his joints allowed it. The injury had never left him completely, but neither, apparently, had it become the center of his life. "You got a minute?" Elias asked. "I've got more than one." "Do you remember the relocation outside Cara Ridge?" The radio on Calvin's side went quiet. He had turned it off. "Yes." Elias gripped the edge of the table. "Jonas left the position." Calvin did not answer. Elias pressed. "He left before we were clear." Another pause. Then Calvin said, "That's not how I remember it." Elias felt something harden in his chest. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly that. He moved the comms package. He moved part of it before I gave release. You weren't the only one giving orders that day. I was controlling the net. You were controlling one net." Elias stood up without realizing it. Tolland rose immediately. "Calvin, I'm not arguing with you. It sounds like you are. No. 16 years ago, I would have argued." Calvin's voice stayed even. "Now I'm telling you what I remember." Elias paced once across the kitchen. "He left us blind." "No. We were already blind. That's not true. Elias." The use of his first name stopped him. Not because Calvin sounded angry, because he sounded tired. "You remember the primary channel dropping?" "Yes." "You remember relay interference?" "Yes." "You remember the movement call coming in?" "I remember conflicting traffic." "So do I." Elias did not speak. Calvin continued. "Jonas heard a relocation order through the secondary line. You had different traffic on primary. You thought the position was supposed to hold until confirmation. That was procedure." "Maybe. Not maybe. Fine. It was procedure." Calvin exhaled. "But procedure didn't fix the broken net." Elias closed his eyes. The old room returned in fragments. Heat, dust, a headset pressing against one ear, 3 voices overlapping, a generator coughing, Jonas at the doorway. "Move the equipment. Wait for confirmation. We don't have time." Those fragments had once fit neatly together. Now the edges refused to line up. "What happened to you?" Elias asked. Calvin's answer came without hesitation. "I got hurt." "You know what I mean." "I know exactly what you mean." Metal scraped on Calvin's end. He was probably sitting down. "My injury happened during the withdrawal." "After Jonas left." "Yes." "You don't connect those things?" "No." Elias laughed once, without humor. "How can you not?" "Because I was there. So was I. That's the problem." Elias stopped pacing. Calvin's voice softened. "We were all there, Kincaid. That doesn't mean we saw the same day." The sentence settled into the kitchen. No accusation, no revelation. Just a fact Elias had spent 16 years avoiding. Calvin went on. "I blamed you for a while." Elias stared at the wall. "For what?" "Staying." Elias turned toward the phone as if Calvin could see him. "You never said that." "You never asked." "That's not fair." "No." Calvin paused. "Neither was blaming Jonas." Elias sat down again. For the first time in the conversation, anger left him faster than he could replace it. Calvin spoke more slowly now. "I thought if you'd moved when Jonas did, maybe the whole mess would have gone differently."
And now? Now I think that's nonsense. Why? Because I got old enough to stop believing every bad thing has one person standing behind it. Elias said nothing. Calvin continued. Jonas thought he had an order. You think he was right? I think he thought he was right. That's not the same. No. And me? You thought you were right. Elias looked down at Tolland. The dog had settled again. Was I? Calvin took a long breath. I don't know.
That answer hurt more than if Calvin had blamed him. Elias had called hoping for certainty, a witness, a clean correction. Instead, he received another imperfect memory. Calvin gave a quiet laugh. You know what's funny? What? For years I thought one of you would call me and ask what happened. Elias stared at the table. Neither of us did. No. Jonas ever call you? Once. Elias's head came up. When? Couple years after. What did he say? Asked how my leg was. That's it? Mostly. And the incident? We talked around it. Elias swallowed. What did he say about me? Calvin was silent long enough that Elias regretted asking. Then, he said you were probably still waiting for everyone else to admit you were right. Elias closed his eyes. That sounded like Jonas. Exactly enough to hurt. Calvin added, and then he said he was probably doing the same thing. The anger inside Elias did not disappear. It changed shape. For years he had carried the memory like a court file. Evidence arranged, statements fixed, verdict already entered. Jonas left, Elias stayed, Calvin got hurt. Friendship ended, case closed. But Calvin had just refused to testify for either side. There had been no villain, no coward, no clean betrayal, only three men working inside damaged communication, each certain enough to act and uncertain enough to suffer afterward. Elias looked toward the guest room. The envelope was still in the drawer. Calvin? Yeah? I should have called. Probably. Elias almost smiled. So should I. They stayed on the line another minute. They did not reconcile 16 years and 60 seconds. They did not promise to visit. Calvin told him his garage heater was failing. Elias told him which relay to check. That was easier. When the call ended, Elias remained at the table. Tolland nudged his hand once, not urgently, just contact. Elias rested his palm over the shepherd's head. I know. This time he did not know what he meant. That afternoon, he returned to the guest room and opened the drawer. The envelope came apart carefully along the old adhesive. Inside were 4 handwritten pages. No formal greeting, no dramatic explanation. Jonas had begun. Elias, I've started this 3 times, which you'll enjoy because you always said I overcomplicated simple things. Elias stopped reading. He could hear Jonas's voice, not remembered perfectly, but enough. He continued. Jonas did not defend the old incident. He mentioned it only briefly. I still think I heard what I heard. I also know you believed the traffic you had. Maybe we both spent too long treating certainty like character. Elias read the sentence again. The next page was harder. Jonas admitted that after the transfer, he had chosen not to call, not because he hated Elias, because he was angry and proud. Then embarrassed by how long the silence had lasted. After a year, calling felt difficult. After 3, it felt absurd. After 5, it felt like admitting I had wasted 5 years. Elias lowered the paper. The room was quiet. Outside, a snowplow moved somewhere down the street. Jonas continued. He wrote about seeing Calvin once, about volunteering at a veterans outreach program, about meeting a young German shepherd with a folded left ear who kept stealing a glove from one of the handlers. Elias looked toward Tolland. The dog was asleep near the door.
For the first time, the photograph from the clarinet case felt less like an impossible coincidence and more like part of a life Jonas had lived without him. The final paragraph was shorter. I don't know whether either of us deserves an apology from the other. Maybe that's been the problem. Maybe we've both been waiting for the other man to walk halfway first. Elias stopped. That sentence did not accuse him. That was why it landed so deeply. He had always imagined reconciliation as a negotiation. Who admitted what? Who had been wrong first? Who owed more?
Jonas, at least by the time he wrote the letter, had apparently grown tired of keeping score. Elias turned the last page. A folded sheet of music slipped into his lap. At the top, handwritten in block letters, "Second watch." Only one melodic line had been completed, clarinet. Below it were scattered chord notes, arrows, erased measures, and small comments in Jonas's handwriting. Too heavy, try again, leave space here. The final bars simply stopped. No ending. Elias stared at the unfinished staff. He expected grief. What came instead was something quieter and more difficult. Regret without anger. 16 years. That was the true loss, not the argument, not the disputed order, not even the injury that had become the hinge of their friendship. 16 years in which either man could have picked up a phone. Neither had. Elias placed the letter beside the music. Tolland woke and crossed the room. He sat near Elias's knee. Elias did not touch him immediately. He looked at the unfinished melody. Then at Jonas's handwriting. For most of his life, Elias had believed unresolved things needed answers. A correct frequency, a repaired circuit, a confirmed order, a fault traced to its source. But some failures did not have a single source. Some simply remained unfinished because two people kept waiting for the other one to begin. Elias rested one hand on Tolland's neck. The dog leaned into it. Outside, evening light faded over Colfax Ridge. Elias did not feel forgiven. He did not feel absolved. He felt something more useful. He finally understood what had been lost. The clarinet remained on the library table for most of the morning. Not because anyone had forgotten it, because no one quite knew what should happen next. Benton had brought coffee. Greer had stopped by long enough to leave a box of cinnamon rolls and complain that the bakery had raised prices again. Lenora had gone to work, after making Elias promise, with unnecessary seriousness, that he would eat lunch before 3. Elias had agreed only because resistance required more energy. Mara sat near the window, with the instrument case open in front of her. For the first time since Elias had met her, she was actually working on the clarinet. She had rolled out a narrow cloth containing small screwdrivers, pads, cork strips, tweezers, and tools Elias could not identify. Her movements were precise without being delicate. She removed one key assembly, inspected the mechanism beneath it, then set it down in exact order. Tolland lay 2 feet away. Not beside the case, beside Mara. His chin rested lightly across the toe of her boot. Mara looked down once. "You've changed sides." Tolland closed his eyes. Elias stood near the coffee maker. "He hasn't." That sounded defensive. "He goes where the heat is." "There's no vent here." Elias glanced toward the dog. "Then he's making poor decisions." Mara smiled and returned to the clarinet. That small exchange did something Elias had not expected. It made the room feel ordinary. For several days, everything connected to Jonas had carried weight. Letters, old arguments, Calvin's voice, the unfinished score folded inside the envelope. Now there was only Mara replacing a dried cork while a German shepherd used her boot as a pillow. Elias found that easier to tolerate. He poured coffee and sat across from her. "You going back today?" Mara did not look up. "That was the plan." "Was?" "The weather changed." Outside, sunlight reflected from the snow, bright and clean.
The highway reports had improved since morning.
Elias looked toward the window.
Road looks fine.
I didn't mean the road.
That made him pause. Mara pressed a new pad into place. For a while, neither spoke. Elias had become better at recognizing when silence was useful and when it was simply another form of avoidance. He was not sure which one this was. Eventually, he asked, "Why did you bring it yourself?" Mara's hand stopped. They had touched that question before. At Pine Junction, she had said Arthur Bellamy had never shipped away the instruments he kept in his hold cabinet. That answer had been true. Elias now understood it had not been complete. Mara set the tool down. "You're asking again." "Yes." "Why?" "Because I think you gave me the practical answer." "And now you want the impractical one?" "I want the honest one." Mara leaned back slightly. "You've gotten demanding." "I've had a strange week." "So have I." Tolland opened one eye, then closed it again. Mara looked down at him. When she spoke again, her voice had changed.
Not softer, less guarded. At first. Then nerve compression, then something else. Her eyes stayed on the silver keys. Eventually there was a diagnosis. Neurodegenerative, progressive. The words sat between them without decoration. Mara continued. At the beginning he kept playing. He changed fingerings, changed instruments for certain pieces, practiced twice as long to make half as much progress. That sounds exhausting. It was. For him, for both of us, she said it plainly. No guilt afterward. Elias respected that. People like to tell stories about caregiving as if love makes exhaustion disappear, Mara said. It doesn't. Elias looked down at his coffee. No. You love someone, you help them, you get tired. Sometimes you get angry because you're tired. Then you feel guilty for being angry. She lifted one shoulder. Then morning comes and you do it again. Tolland shifted his head slightly against her boot. Mara's foot stayed still. When did he stop playing? About 4 years before he died. That must have been hard.
For him.
She paused. And for me, though I didn't understand that until later. Elias waited. I restored instruments partly because Graham played them. Our whole life had sound in it. Rehearsals, scales, musicians dropping by, cases opening, reeds soaking in coffee cups because nobody could find clean water. A small smile appeared. After he stopped playing, the house became quiet before he was gone. That sentence caught Elias more strongly than he expected. Not because it resembled his own story, because it did not. He had created silence deliberately. Mara had watched it arrive, despite everything she did to prevent it. When he died, she continued, people kept bringing me instruments. To repair? To help me. Elias frowned. They thought work would help. Did it? At first. She picked up one of the clarinet keys and rolled it between her fingers. Then every instrument came with a story.
She changed her voice slightly, mimicking customers without cruelty. My father played this trumpet in college. My wife's flute hasn't been touched since she died. This violin belonged to my brother. Mara put the key down. I realized I had started dreading the stories. Because of Graham. Because everyone wanted me to understand what the object meant. She looked at Elias. And I did. That was the problem. Elias understood. Mara continued. I became very good at taking jobs where nobody needed me to care. Technical repairs, yes. Commercial clients, yes. Schools, those were easiest. She nodded. Replace pads, fix keywork, invoice, send it back. No history, no grief. No one standing across the counter hoping you'll somehow return more than the instrument. Elias looked toward the open clarinet case. So Bellamy's shop was supposed to be the last one.
Mara's eyes sharpened slightly. You figured that out? You said you were clearing inventory.
I was also planning to leave restoration. For what? A manufacturer outside Spokane offered me quality control work.
Steady?
Very.
Good benefits?
Excellent.
You sound miserable.
Mara smiled without amusement.
That's because you're annoying.
Elias leaned back. Did you take it?
I said I would.
When do you start?
3 weeks.
The answer surprised him. He looked at the clarinet. And this?
This was supposed to be the last unresolved job.
Why didn't you send it to the archive?
I nearly did.
What stopped you? Mara rested both hands on the table.
Arthur.
He's dead.
I'm aware.
Elias waited. Mara looked toward the case.
He used to say instruments weren't valuable because they were expensive. They were valuable because somebody had once expected to make sound with them.
That sounds like something an old repairman would say.
He said many things that sounded better after he died.
Elias smiled. Mara continued.
When I found Jonas's clarinet, it was already repaired, clean, packed, ready. She touched the worn edge of the canvas. Arthur had kept it that way for years. And you felt responsible. No, the answer came quickly. I felt curious. Elias raised an eyebrow. That all? At first. Then she looked at him more directly. After that, I thought one more attempt wouldn't hurt. To find the owner. To find where it belonged. The distinction mattered. Elias understood why only after several seconds. You don't believe objects belong to people forever. No. Then what? Sometimes they belong to a place, a memory, a use. She gestured toward the clarinet. Or sometimes they should simply be allowed to stop being lost. Tolland lifted his head, not toward the instrument, toward Mara. She looked down. The dog stood, circled once, then settled again with his shoulder against her shin. Mara froze for half a second. Elias saw it. Tolland had been comfortable around her before. This was different. He had chosen contact. Mara's hand moved instinctively toward his head, then stopped before touching him.
Is that okay?
Elias nodded. He'll leave if it isn't. She placed her palm lightly behind Tolland's ear. The shepherd exhaled and let his eyes close. Mara's expression changed in a way Elias had not seen before. No sadness, no surprise. Relief, perhaps. Something smaller than relief. Permission. She stroked the folded tip of Tolland's left ear once. He recognized Jonas. Probably. And now? Elias watched the dog. Now he recognizes you. Mara looked at him. That's not how scent works. No. Elias took a drink of coffee, but that's not what I meant. She understood. Neither said anything more about it. Later, Benton arrived, carrying a box of old cables. He dropped it onto the table beside Elias. Found these in storage. Elias opened the box. A mess of coax connectors, audio leads, adapters, and 2 power supplies stared back at him.
What am I supposed to do with this? Feel useful.
I didn't say I wanted to. You looked at the radio yesterday. That was a mistake. Benton nodded toward the rear corner of the community room. Then don't look over there. Elias looked. An old tabletop receiver sat beneath a shelf. Beside it was a cassette deck with one missing button and a small guitar amplifier whose power light had been taped over. Elias frowned. How long has that amp been dead? 6 months? What happened? Smoke. From where? Inside. That's generally bad. See? Already useful. Elias stood despite himself. Mara watched him cross the room. You know he did that on purpose. Yes. Benton smiled. Of course I did. Elias crouched beside the amplifier. Dust covered the rear panel.
He unplugged it before opening anything, then removed 2 screws with the multi-tool from his pocket. Benton stared. "You carry that everywhere?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because people own things like this." The back panel came loose.
Elias leaned closer. Burnt resistor, possibly more. He forgot the room for several minutes. Not in the old way, not disappearing into memory. This was concentration, different thing entirely. He traced the circuit visually, checked the fuse, then asked Benton whether there was a multimeter anywhere in the building. Benton pointed toward a cabinet. "Top shelf." Elias found a cheap digital meter buried beneath extension cords. "That thing is terrible." "It was donated." "That doesn't make it better." Mara laughed from across the room. Elias ignored her. He worked for nearly 40 minutes. No one asked him to hurry. No one needed a report. No one was paying him. No supervisor would sign off on the repair. The amplifier simply did not work. That was enough. When Elias replaced the damaged resistor and powered the unit through Benton's old current limiter, the small red light came on. No smoke. Benton connected an old radio to the input. Static burst through the speaker. Then music. Weak. Slightly distorted. But music. Benton leaned against the table. "Well," Elias listened. "Speaker's tired." "It works." "Barely. That counts here." Elias looked around the room. Mara was still at the table, one hand resting on Tolland's shoulder while she inspected the clarinet. Benton stood beside the resurrected amplifier. 2 empty chairs waited near the wall. The place was unimpressive, too warm, poorly organized. Half the equipment should probably have been recycled 20 years earlier. And yet, Elias felt no urge to leave. That bothered him enough to notice. Benton noticed too. "You don't owe Jonas a monument," he said. Elias looked at him. "I wasn't planning one." "Good. I don't owe him anything." Benton nodded. "Probably true." The lack of argument annoyed Elias. "Then what's your point?" "My point is you keep talking about what you owe dead people." Benton gestured around the room. "Maybe spend some time asking what you want from the living." Elias looked away. The sentence would have irritated him more a week earlier. Now it simply stayed. That evening, Mara packed her tools, but left the clarinet at the library with Benton's permission. "I'll finish it tomorrow," she said. "I thought you were leaving." "So did I." Elias glanced at her. "Roads?" "Roads are fine." He understood. Mara put on her coat. Tolland rose with her. For a moment, Elias expected the dog to follow. Instead, Tolland walked 2 steps, touched his nose briefly to Mara's hand, then returned to Elias. Mara looked down at him. "No more staring at my luggage?" Tolland sat beside Elias. "He got what he wanted," Elias said. "What was that?" Elias considered the question. "I'm not sure." Mara smiled. "That makes 2 of us." After she left, Elias remained in the community room. Benton had gone upstairs. The building was nearly silent. Elias looked at the old receiver on the shelf, then at the cassette deck, then at the amplifier he had brought back to life. He had spent years fixing things because that was what he was trained to do. Equipment failed. Signals dropped. Circuits burned. Find the fault. Restore function. Move on. This had felt different. No mission, no duty, no reason except that someone might want to hear the thing work again. Elias reached toward the dead cassette deck, then stopped. He smiled faintly. "One at a time." Tolland lay down beside him, one paw touching the toe of Elias's boot. Outside, snow began drifting lazily through the light from the library windows. For the first time since arriving in Colfax Ridge, Elias was not thinking about whether he would stay. He was thinking about what he might fix tomorrow. Elias did not decide to stay in Colfax Ridge all at once. There was no morning when he woke, looked out at the snow, and declared the experiment permanent. Instead, 1 week passed, then another. He stopped checking the storage unit website in Spokane. He stopped counting how many shirts remained in the duffel bag. Lenora cleared one extra shelf in the guest room closet without asking whether he needed it. Elias noticed. He said nothing. By the beginning of February, his answer to anyone who asked how long he was staying had become, "Through winter." It was specific enough to end most conversations, and vague enough to mean almost anything. 3 afternoons a week, he walked with Tolland to the library. The community room downstairs had changed without anyone officially changing it. The old amplifier Elias repaired now sat on a shelf instead of the floor. Benton found a folding work table in municipal storage. Greer donated a dented metal cabinet full of connectors, screws, electrical tape, and small parts in envelopes that were labeled in handwriting no one could read. The first radio arrived on a Tuesday. Its owner was a retired lineman named Douglas Marr, 72, who placed it on the table and said, "It worked when Carter was president." Elias looked at the cracked plastic case. "That's not encouraging." Douglas shrugged. "I've been told the same thing about me." He stayed while Elias opened the back panel. Not because Elias needed help, because there was coffee. The second item was a cassette deck, brought by a former truck mechanic who insisted he only wanted to know whether it was worth throwing away. He remained for 2 hours. A week later, he returned with 3 cassette tapes. Then came a tabletop shortwave receiver, a guitar pedal with a damaged jack, an old reel-to-reel machine Benton admitted had been sitting in a closet since before he started running the group. None of it was organized. That was part of why it worked. People arrived because they had something broken, then remained because someone else was already there. Benton did not call it therapy. Elias would probably have stopped coming if he had. He called it Tuesday. Mara was still in Colfax Ridge. Her few extra days had become nearly 2 weeks. She had changed her hotel reservation twice. The clarinet was almost finished. The pads had been replaced where necessary, 2 springs adjusted, the tenon cork renewed, and the silver keywork cleaned carefully without stripping away every mark of age. Mara refused to make it look new. "It isn't new," she told Elias when he asked why she left a small scratch near the lower joint. "You could remove that." "I could, so why not?" "Because restoration and erasure aren't the same job." Elias looked at the scratch. "I suppose that's one way to justify leaving work unfinished." Mara gave him a flat look. "You repair radios with electrical tape." "Temporarily." "So do I." Tolland lay between their tables, apparently satisfied that both humans were behaving. His attention no longer centered on the clarinet. Most afternoons he wandered between Elias and Mara, then settled wherever the room was warmest or where someone had dropped a piece of cracker. The change was subtle enough that Elias almost missed what it meant. The instrument had stopped being a problem to solve. It had become something that belonged in the room. One Thursday, Benton came downstairs carrying a portable digital recorder. Elias looked at it. "No." "I haven't asked anything." "You were going to." Benton set the recorder on the table. "Greer thinks we should record some of the stories people tell here." "No." "Why?" "Because the second you put a microphone in front of somebody, they stop talking like themselves." Benton nodded. "Sometimes. Usually." "Then don't point it at them." Elias looked at the recorder again. "What exactly do you want?" "Nothing formal." Benton pulled out a chair. "Douglas was talking last week about repairing power lines during the winter of '79. Warren told me about playing piano in a bass chapel in Germany. Greer has enough postal stories to ruin several evenings." From across the room, Greer said, "I heard that." "You were meant to," Benton continued. "People tell things when their hands are busy. Maybe some of it should be kept." Elias folded his arms. "For who?" Benton considered that. "Maybe for themselves." That answer made Elias less resistant than he wanted to be. He picked up the recorder. Cheap built-in microphones, small memory card, 1 headphone output. "Battery life?" 6 hours. "Probably 4. Can you make it 6? "No." Benton smiled. "Good.
You're learning boundaries." Elias stared at him. Across the room, Mara laughed. By the end of the week, the recorder sat near the workbench with a handwritten card beside it. "If you want this on, turn it on." Nothing else. No consent forms.
No interview schedule, no questions taped to the wall. For 3 days, nobody touched it. On the 4th, Douglas switched it on while replacing a frayed speaker wire and spent 7 minutes explaining why utility trucks in 1979 were designed by people who hated human spines. That evening, Elias listened back. The recording was imperfect. Coffee cups knocked against the table. Someone coughed. Tolland's collar jingled. But Douglas sounded exactly like Douglas. Elias saved the file. He named it MAR D001. Then immediately hated how official it looked. He renamed it Douglas Winter 79. That felt better. A week later, Greer announced that the room needed a name. "No," Elias said. Greer continued as if he had not spoken. "We can't keep saying the downstairs thing." "Why not?" "Because it sounds illegal." Benton was sorting coffee filters. "I've heard worse." Mara sat near the window, fitting the final joint of the clarinet. Greer pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "I made a list." "That sentence is never reassuring," Elias said. Greer ignored him. "Signal house." "No," Elias said. "Repair table." "No." "North room." "We're in the basement." "Second bench." Mara shook her head. Greer frowned at the page. "You people are difficult." "That should be the name," Benton said. "Difficult people?" "Accurate." Greer looked toward Elias. "What about Halston?" The room changed. Only slightly, but enough. Elias set down the soldering iron. "What about him?" "Halston room, Jonas house, something like that." "No." Greer blinked. "That was fast. It's not happening." No one challenged him immediately. Elias looked around the room. At the radio shells, at the coffee pot, at Mara's tools, at Douglas arguing with a tape deck, at Tolland asleep beneath the table. "This place doesn't belong to Jonas." Greer lowered the paper. "I didn't say it did." "You name it after him. People start treating him like the reason it exists." Benton watched Elias carefully. "Isn't he part of the reason?" "Part." Elias wiped his hands on a cloth. "But he wasn't a saint." No one spoke. Elias continued. "He got angry. He held grudges. He walked away from people." Mara looked down at the clarinet. "So did I." The words came out before Elias had time to soften them. The room stayed quiet. Then Mara nodded. "So did he." That was all. No offense, no correction. Greer folded his list. "What would you call it?" Elias had no answer. Then Mara reached into the case and removed the folded sheet of music. She placed it on the table. At the top, in Jonas's block handwriting, "Second watch." Greer read it. "That sounds military." "Not exactly," Elias said. He picked up the page. The title had bothered him when he first saw it. Now it felt different, a second watch, a later shift, the hours after someone else thought the important part of the day was over. Benton leaned against the counter. "Could mean what comes after." "After what?" Greer asked. "Whatever people thought was the main part." Mara glanced around the room. "Career?" "Marriage," Benton added. "Service," said Douglas from the other table. Greer lifted one hand. "Bad decisions." Elias looked at him. "That seems broad." "I contain multitudes." A few people laughed. Elias looked at the unfinished music again. He did not want Jonas's name over the door, but this was different. The title did not belong only to Jonas anymore. "Second watch," Elias said. Greer nodded. "That one stays." There was no vote, no ceremony. Greer wrote it on a piece of masking tape and stuck it crookedly above the coffee maker. Mara looked at it. "That's terrible." "I'll make a proper sign."
Please do." Tolland opened one eye, then went back to sleep. A few days later, Mara finished the clarinet. She did not announce it. She assembled the instrument at the long table, checked each key, warmed the bore, and played a chromatic scale quietly enough that conversations around the room continued.
The sound was dark and clear. Elias looked up from the amplifier he was adjusting. He had heard Jonas play that instrument years ago. Not this exact sound. That distinction mattered. The clarinet had changed. So had the room. So had everyone listening. Warren Pike Ellery was the first to ask about the sheet music. He was 67, tall and lean, with close-cropped silver hair and long hands that looked almost too elegant for the chipped ceramic mug he carried. Warren had spent most of his working life in logistics and most of his private life insisting he was not a pianist, despite having played since his 20s. Mara handed him the page. He read it standing up, then frowned. "This stops." "Yes," Elias said. "I can see that." "You asked." Warren looked at the penciled notes below the melody. "Were these supposed to be chords?" "Probably." "Probably is dangerous. Then you'll fit in." Warren took a short wooden pencil from his shirt pocket. He always carried one. No one knew why.
He sat at the old upright piano in the corner, tested 3 keys, disliked 2 of them, and began writing. Elias watched for less than a minute, then returned to the amplifier. He had no interest in becoming part of the performance. That was not avoidance. It was simply not his role. His role was to make sure the cables worked. The amplifier did not hum. The recorder captured both instruments. The loose microphone stand stayed upright after Elias tightened it. That was enough. The first attempt at second watch happened on a Friday evening with 9 people in the room. No invitations, no audience, no printed program. Mara sat with the clarinet near the window. Warren sat at the piano. Benton poured coffee. Greer adjusted the masking tape sign even though it remained crooked. Elias sat at the small audio table beside the recorder. Tolland lay beneath it, his head resting across Elias's boot. Mara raised the instrument. Warren counted quietly. They began. The melody was simple. Not sentimental, not martial. It moved in long phrases with more empty space than Elias expected. Mara missed one entrance. Warren stopped. "I went too fast." "You always say that after I miss." "Professional courtesy," she smiled. They started again. Halfway through, Mara stopped playing. No one asked why. Her hand lowered slightly. She looked at the instrument, then toward the window. Elias knew enough not to rescue the moment. Warren rested his hands on his knees. Benton looked at his coffee. Tolland remained still. After several seconds, Mara inhaled. "Again from 32. Warren nodded. They continued. The final written measure arrived too soon. Jonas had never finished the piece. Warren had resisted creating an ending. Instead, his accompaniment simply thinned until the clarinet line stopped where Jonas's pencil had stopped. Then silence. No applause. Douglas cleared his throat. Greer poured more coffee. Someone near the back said, "That was good." Mara lowered the clarinet. "Parts of it." "That counts here," Benton said. Elias recognized the phrase. He looked at Benton. Benton smiled. Later, when everyone began leaving, Elias remained by the audio table. The recording had saved correctly. He could see the waveform on the small screen. A complete record of an incomplete piece. Tolland shifted against his leg. Elias took out his phone. Calvin answered on the 3rd ring. "Whitlow, it's me. I guessed." "How?" "You're the only person who calls and spends 3 seconds deciding whether to speak." Elias looked toward the room. Mara was packing the clarinet. Warren was erasing something from the music. Greer was replacing the crooked tape sign with another crooked tape sign. Elias smiled. "We played something Jonas wrote." Calvin was quiet. "He wrote music?" "Apparently." "Was it any good?" "Parts of it."
Calvin laughed softly. Then neither man spoke. Elias could have told him about the room, about the name, about the recorder, about Tolland.
Instead, he said the one thing that mattered. "I wish we'd talked sooner." The line went quiet, not awkwardly. Calvin answered, "Me too." Nothing else was necessary. No apology negotiated, no history corrected, no promise that the years had not mattered. They had. That was why the sentence meant anything. After the call, Elias put the phone away. Mara approached the audio table. "How was he?" "Calvin?" "Yes." "Still Calvin." "That sounds reassuring." "It is." She looked toward the masking tape sign. "You staying through winter?" Elias glanced at her. "That's what I said." "And after?" He looked around second watch. The broken cassette deck waited on one table. 2 radios waited on another. A stack of blank labels sat beside the recorder. Tolland was asleep again. Elias did not answer the question, not because he was avoiding it, because for once he did not need the answer yet. Outside, snow fell across Colfax Ridge in slow, bright flakes. Inside, the room remained imperfect, unfinished, and occupied. That was enough. A year later, winter returned to Colfax Ridge without asking whether anyone was ready for it. Snow gathered along the roofs in thin layers first, then deepened over 3 quiet storms until the town looked much the way it had when Elias arrived. Some things had changed. Most had not. The pharmacy still closed too early on Saturdays. Greer still complained about the bakery prices and bought cinnamon rolls anyway. The piano downstairs at the library remained slightly flat in the upper register, despite Warren's repeated attempts to convince everyone that humidity was responsible. And the piece of masking tape above the coffee maker had finally been replaced by a wooden sign. Second watch. The letters were uneven. Douglas had made it. Elias had refused to correct them. The room itself stayed small. There were no newspaper clippings on the wall, no photographs of politicians visiting, no plaques listing major donors. Nobody had created a mission statement.
There was one more work table than the year before, 2 additional shelves for donated equipment, and a better power strip because Elias had eventually threatened to unplug the entire room if Greer kept connecting extension cords to other extension cords. That was growth as far as Elias was concerned. On most Tuesdays, somebody brought something that did not work. Sometimes Elias could repair it, sometimes he could not. People returned, either way. An old receiver became an excuse for coffee. A guitar amplifier became an afternoon. A tape recorder became a conversation between 2 men who had discovered they had been stationed in Germany within 12 miles of each other 27 years earlier. The little digital recorder still sat near the workbench. Its handwritten sign had faded, "If you want this on, turn it on." People did. Not often. That made the recordings better.
There were stories about long drives, failed marriages, first jobs after discharge, radios carried through rain, terrible military food, good dogs, bad commanders, lost friends, and one argument lasting 11 minutes about whether powdered eggs had ever technically been eggs. Elias kept the files. He no longer numbered them. Mara came down from Spokane twice a month when weather allowed, not every week. Not enough to turn her visits into a schedule Elias depended upon. That was important to both of them. She had declined the full-time quality control position after all, though not for any romantic reason, and not because Colfax Ridge had somehow revealed her destiny. Instead, she negotiated part-time contract work with the manufacturer and kept her restoration bench. One day each week she reserved for instruments that made no financial sense. A dented flute belonging to a retired schoolteacher, a clarinet from a man's late brother, an oboe nobody could afford to restore completely, so Mara repaired only enough to make it playable. She called those days her bad business decisions. Elias suspected she was proud of them.
Their friendship had become easy in the way neither of them would have trusted at the beginning. They called occasionally, argued about repair techniques, sent each other photographs of poorly designed electrical work. When Mara came to Colfax Ridge, she sometimes stayed at Lenora's for dinner. Sometimes she did not. No one asked where the relationship was going because it was not required to go anywhere. That, too, felt new. Calvin called most Thursday evenings. Not every Thursday, just often enough that Elias had stopped being surprised by the Oregon area code. They almost never discussed the old incident anymore. Calvin talked about motorcycles. Elias complained about donated electronics that had been repaired with household glue.
Once, Calvin mailed him a radio receiver with a note taped to the top. "Since you like impossible causes." Elias repaired it and mailed it back. The note returned 2 weeks later. Calvin had written, beneath his own sentence, "Apparently not impossible." Elias kept that note in the drawer beneath his soldering station, not as a memorial, just because it made him laugh. Lenora noticed everything. She had stopped asking how long Elias intended to stay. That question had become unnecessary sometime around spring, when Elias finally emptied the Spokane storage unit and brought the last boxes to Colfax Ridge. He rented a small house 6 blocks from hers, close enough for dinner, far enough that Lenora could not appear unannounced without feeling at least slightly guilty. Elias considered that an ideal distance for siblings. Tolland adapted to the new house first. The German Shepherd was 10 now. More silver had spread across his muzzle, turning the black around his nose into a softer gray.
His left ear still folded slightly at the tip. The golden patch inside his right foreleg had faded, but remained visible when he stretched. Winter made his rear legs stiff. Elias noticed more hesitation on stairs, more time spent choosing whether standing up was worth the effort. But Tolland remained observant. He simply no longer believed every observation required action. That lesson, Elias sometimes thought, had gone both ways. On a bright morning in January, Elias fastened Tolland's dark olive service harness and checked the time. Veterinary appointment in Spokane. Routine. Nothing serious. Lenora had offered to drive. Elias declined. "Bus is easier." Lenora stared at him. "You hated the bus." "I disliked one bus." "You spent 6 months telling people that bus changed your life." "I never said that." "Other people did." "Other people exaggerate." Lenora handed him a thermos. "You're taking this." "I can buy coffee." "You can also drink good coffee." "This isn't good coffee." "Then give it back!"
Elias put it in his bag. Lenora smiled.
Tolland watched the exchange with the patience of a dog familiar with family rituals. The bus station looked almost exactly as it had a year earlier. Same narrow shelter, same bench. Different driver. Elias chose a window seat. Tolland folded himself beside his boots with more care than before. The bus pulled west. Snowfields moved past the window. Telephone poles, barn roofs, bare trees standing dark against the white. The engine produced a steady, low vibration. Someone behind Elias opened a bag of chips before 9 in the morning. A woman across the aisle slept with her coat folded beneath her head. Everything was ordinary. Elias noticed that he liked it. A year earlier, ordinary things had felt temporary to him. Waiting rooms, guest rooms, meals with family, places where he stayed without belonging. Now the ordinary had acquired weight. Not excitement, not meaning in every object, weight, something worth returning to.
Tolland shifted under the seat. His paw touched Elias's boot. Elias looked down. "You cold?" The shepherd looked toward the window. "Good talk." Tolland lowered his head again. At the next stop, 4 passengers boarded. Elias barely noticed the first 3. The fourth was a man in his mid-60s, wearing a brown canvas coat and carrying a battered black guitar case.
One latch was held closed with gray tape. The man lifted the case carefully as he climbed aboard, muttering an apology when the lower edge bumped a seat. Tolland's head came up. Elias felt his body react before his mind did, a tightening, small, instant. The dog watched the guitar case. Elias watched the dog. For one absurd second, the whole previous winter seemed to arrange itself behind the moment. Green canvas, an old name, Mara in the 6th row, Jonas, letters, a photograph. Elias almost expected Tolland to stand. He did not. The German shepherd sniffed once, then yawned, a long, unimpressed yawn.
He put his head back on his paws.
Elias stared at him. Tolland closed his eyes. Elias began to laugh, quietly at first. The man with the guitar glanced over. Something funny? Elias shook his head. Not really. The man nodded in the polite way strangers did when they suspected an explanation would take too long. He moved farther down the aisle. Elias looked out the window. He felt foolish. Then something else. Relieved, perhaps. Not because there was no mystery, because he no longer needed one. For a long time, Elias had treated unexpected things like signals. Something happened, therefore something meant something. A dog stared, a name appeared, a man left, another man was injured. Silence followed. He had spent 16 years arranging events into a story that made emotional sense because uncertainty had felt intolerable. Jonas's letters had broken that habit. Calvin had broken it further. Second Watch had finished the job. Not everything was a message. Sometimes a dog looked at a guitar because guitars smelled interesting. Sometimes a stranger was simply a stranger. Sometimes the important thing was not what an object meant, it was what the person carrying it needed in the moment. The bus continued through the snow. At a roadside stop nearly 40 minutes later, the man with the guitar stood. He reached overhead for a canvas bag. The guitar case had been stored awkwardly on the rack across from him. He pulled once. The broken latch caught on the metal lip. He tried again. The case twisted. Elias watched. A year earlier he might have waited, not from cruelty, from habit. People handled their own problems unless they asked. That had always seemed respectful. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was just distance dressed as principle. The man pulled again. Elias stood. "Hold on. I've got it. I can see that." The man looked at him. Elias reached up. "Lift your end." Together they angled the case away from the rack. The damaged latch cleared. Elias lowered it carefully into the aisle. The man adjusted his grip. "Thanks." He smiled with mild embarrassment. "Thought I could manage it myself." Elias looked at the taped latch. "Probably could." The man waited. Elias added, "Doesn't mean you have to." Something about the sentence made the man smile more fully. "No, I guess not." Tolland had risen beside Elias. His tail moved once. The man looked down. "Good-looking shepherd." "He knows." "I had one years ago." Elias almost asked about him. The question reached his mouth. Then he stopped. Not because he was avoiding connection, because the man was trying to catch a bus transfer. There would be other strangers, other conversations. Not every opening had to become a story. "Take care of the latch," Elias said. The man lifted the guitar case. "That's the plan." He stepped off the bus. Elias returned to his seat. Tolland circled once before lying down. The bus pulled away. Through the glass, the man became smaller beside the roadside shelter. Black guitar case leaning against one leg. Then the road curved. He disappeared. Elias took out his phone. There was a message from Mara, a photograph. She had placed a badly worn silver flute on her workbench. Beneath it, "Today's bad financial decision." Elias typed, "Looks expensive." Her reply arrived almost immediately. Emotionally, yes. He smiled. A second message appeared. "How's Tolland?" Elias looked down. The shepherd was asleep, offended by public transportation,
3 dots, then so normal. Elias put the phone away. He thought about Jonas, not with the old tightness, not even with the particular ache that had followed the letter, just as a person. Jonas laughing over terrible coffee, Jonas holding a clarinet, Jonas angry, Jonas wrong, Jonas right about some things, Jonas wasting years, Elias wasting years. A whole human being restored from the flat shape of a grievance. That, Elias understood now, was enough.
He had once thought the letter meant Jonas had left him a responsibility, finish the music, build something, make the lost years useful. He no longer believed that. Second watch existed because living people had found a use for a room. The music had been played because Mara wanted to play it and Warren wanted to accompany her. Calvin answered the phone because Elias finally called. None of those things were debts owed to Jonas. They were choices made after him. There was freedom in that distinction. Outside, sunlight spread across the snowfields. The brightness looked very much like the morning a year earlier. But Elias did not. Tolland had watched a woman carrying the scent of someone they once knew. That had been enough to make Elias turn his head. The rest had required something the dog could never do for him. Elias had needed to keep looking, not backward, at people, at Lenora carrying bad coffee in a steel thermos, at Mara deciding which instruments were worth losing money on, at Calvin answering on Thursday nights, at old men bringing broken radios into a basement because fixing something beside another person was easier than sitting alone at home, at strangers struggling with guitar cases. The bus rolled west. Tolland's paw slid against Elias's boot as the road curved. Elias left it there. A year earlier, he had boarded a bus wanting a smaller life. What he found instead was not larger, just less empty. And for the first time in a very long while, that was enough. Sometimes peace does not come from getting every answer. It comes when we stop asking the past to become different and begin noticing the people who are still beside us. Elias could not recover the 16 years he lost with Jonas, but he learned that an unfinished friendship did not have to become an unfinished life. Sometimes grace arrives quietly, in a phone call finally made, a seat offered at a table, or a stranger who chooses to help without being asked. If you are carrying words you have waited too long to say, perhaps today is still a good day to begin. Tell us in the comments what part of this story stayed with you, and if you value stories about loyalty, second chances, and the quiet ways people find their way back to one another, please subscribe and join us for the next one. May you find peace with what cannot be changed and courage for what can still be done.